through poetry and narratives. Nirupma is a poet, a journalist, a translator who writes in English and Punjabi and Hindi. Women are the most affected, as we know, by the displacements that continue to occur worldwide, posing the ever-challenging question, when will we ever learn? So let's hear about the madness of migration.
I have with me a rare set of the panelists who have done a lot of work in migration, and for this session in particular we are talking about the madness of migration or the impact of migration, because migration is of many kinds. There is a willing migration to a sought after migration, though it may also have negative impact. Recently I went to a Gurdwara in the Doaba region of Jalandhar, from which the largest number of people have migrated abroad since late 19th century. And there is a Gurdwara where the people come, it's called the Talhan Gurdwara, and offer aeroplanes so that they may be able to fly. And they get as many as 2,000 aeroplanes a day, which they can't store. So they give them back as prasad to the kids who come, and even ask the older people that would you like to take an aeroplane home for the children. So that is another thing. But here we are talking of partition, we are talking of the Northeast and migration and the kind of impact it leaves. Even I'd like to quote a line of poetry by a very well-known poet of Indian origin who went to America and made a name for herself, Ritika Wazirani. And she said that a migrant dies every day. And finally, because of depression and other factors, she did commit suicide. And then in the Indian context, in the context of partition, we have Saadat Hasan Manto, whose protagonist, Bishna Singh, is being transferred with other mad people to India because he's a Sikh. Sikhs and Hindus are being sent away. And he chooses to die on the no man's land because the only place he wants to go to, his village, is Toba Tek Singh. So it is in this context of migration that I'd like to talk to you. And first of all, Shalim, and since you're the youngest in the panel, we should start with you. I learned that you are working on a book of migrants along the riverline. This would be in Assam. Please let us know, because we know little.
Thank you for having us. It's very nice being here. I come from a family, both sides of my family are descendants of migrants who came from what is now Bangladesh. And they settled on two sides of the Brahmaputra river. So my mother's family, my mother's grandfather actually, he settled on the north side of the river, in a village on the north side. And my father's side of the family, they settled on the south side. And so I'm a product of the two banks of the river Brahmaputra. And anyone who has lived in Assam would know that the north and the south don't really go very well together. I'm researching on a book about the descendants of the migrants, not on the migration itself, because we don't have people who are first generation migrants, nor do we have those stories, unlike in Bengal where the migration is so recent and where the stories have come into light so much. Our migration has happened a long time ago and those people are gone. The stories remain in narrative, in songs, in the stories that older people tell the children and so on. But a direct result of this migration has been a growth of xenophobic hatred against this community. And this community has faced a lot of violence over the years, beginning with the 1983 Nelly massacre and subsequent attacks of violent attacks in 94, 2012, 2004 and so on and so forth. So I'm doing a story of people who have witnessed the 1983 violence and younger people of my generation who have grown up in the 1994 violence. So there are a few stories which are pretty sad. In 1983, for example, when the violence happened, there was a lot of fake news going around that arsonists were coming to every Muslim village and burning the houses and so on. So my maternal grandfather, he took his children and his old parents and he went and hid in a rice field. And they remained there for 2 days without any food. On the third day, my eldest aunt, her husband came and got them from the rice field. And they devised a plan on how to survive the arsonists, which was that during the daytime they would remain at home, and at night someone would take them to a safer location. Because if they didn't remain at home in the daytime, the houses might be burned. At night they couldn't take the risk of staying back at home. Now I thought that this story was old and these acts of violence had gone away, but I met people who had survived the 1994 violence. And these are young people of my generation, people just a little bit older or a little bit younger than me. And the same stories happen. Same attacks, burning of houses, and they hide in the fields, stay without food for a long time, and so on. So this is basically what I'm working on. The horrors of or what goes through a migrant's mind, it passes on through generations. The hatred lives on, the pain lives on. That's what I'm saying.
Have you given a working title to your book?
Not yet, I haven't yet.
Shalim, I'm glad you acquainted us with this. And now I would like to ask Reena Anand, who has written a novel, journey from Quetta to Delhi. It is the journey of her family, her mother, at the time of partition. One, I would like to ask you about migration, the kind it was at the time of partition. And secondly, what moved you to write this novel so many years later? Were you a small child at the time of partition?
Well, I was young, but the main thing is that partition never left us, because my mother was constantly speaking about her homeland, about her watan. And for us, that Punjab, the West Punjab, is very much alive. And my book is actually not about massacres and heinous crimes. It's about a woman's love for her homeland and how there were many people like her, refugees, who forgave. In forgetting, they forgave. People say, why were they silent? Well, their silence was a form of forgiving of what happened. And their love for their homeland was so much that, they passed it on to us. They were constantly speaking about West Punjab, about Jhang, where she came from, Quetta, where her family migrated. Now, migration, her grandfather already migrated to Quetta without any loss of Punjabi culture. There was a huge Punjabi community in Balochistan, mainly Balochistan service agency service officers, teachers, doctors, and there was no loss of culture. There was an additional gain of culture from the Pathan and the Baloch. They learned words of Pashto instead of saying Sasyakal, Ji-I-Ya-No, which was the old Punjabi way of greeting, which we have forgotten. They used to say Khushamdi, Tadam. So they learnt, it was an addition of culture. What is very important about partition is, first of all, it is not voluntary migration. It is a forced migration. It is an exile under the threat of bloodshed. You are forced to leave your home and you have to flee with practically nothing except, I think, your culture. And that also is very strange. Why could this Punjabi culture, which had survived transit to Balochistan, not survive in Delhi? And what I have described is what my mother told me, all about the Punjabi culture. What were our birth rituals? What were our marriage rituals? For example, she spoke a lot about the social system, which will surprise people, because she said Punjabis were very practical people and they didn't believe that man was by nature monogamous. And the customary law, she described to me the customary law which prevailed over, you know, the, what should I say, the British imposed juridical system, and by which within families and all, many relationships were permitted. And the wedding songs actually reflect this. You know, the Gigi, the Sala and the Gigi, the Devar and the, you know, Bhabi. So it's actually a description of all this with lots of folk songs and folk sayings, you know, like, you know, the women used to dye their own chunnis. So, you know, Chabbi diyan chunniyan main mal mal dhoniyan, mera mai gaya pardesh main cham cham roniyan.
So it's, you know, recreating the lost culture. But what about the impact on the mind of your protagonist?
Well, it was a very deep psychological, psychiatric, I should say. My Nani went almost, I mean, she was almost berserk. And she had a really major nervous breakdown, which I now understand as a nervous breakdown. Similarly, my mother, many years after. And then I read about that, and then I came to know that, you know, there is a there can be a psychological traumatic trauma long after the event has actually occurred. And then I said to myself, okay, this strange behavior was due to the partition, to what the partition caused. But you see, women's illnesses were never, well, even now they're not recognized very much. But at that time, I mean, nobody ever thought of a woman having, you know, that she could have a psychic problem. And it's not just that. My grandfather, it was a huge, huge problem for him, because he elected to stay on in Quetta, and he elected to be a member of the Pakistan civil service. But after 9 months, his Pathan friend said, you have to go. You can't bring your family here, which is what he was hoping. You just have to go. And he was never the same.
Thank you, Reena. And you talk of, you know, the trauma, the psychological impact, and we have a psychiatrist with us, Anirudh Kala, who has come out with a book called The Unsafe Asylum, and it deals with, you know, it's called Stories of Partition and Madness. Dr. Kala, I would like to ask you how you went on to record these stories and what led you to this book.
See, talking of migration, partition of India was very well known to be the largest migration in the history of mankind. During peacetime, well, they say during peacetime there were, I mean, 10 lakh people died in a few months. It wasn't peacetime at all. So anyway, my interest in the partition, or how does this book evolve, starts from the fact that I am a psychiatrist, and when I joined psychiatry, which was about 25 years after the partition of India, there were still patients coming. Like the one Reena described her mother, there were still patients coming with the psychiatric sequelae of partition, and that's how I got interested in it. I'll tell you one example of a patient. A middle-aged woman was brought by her teenage daughter because she was paranoid and said that रोशनदानों में से मुसलमान आते हैं छुरियां लेके और वो अल्लाह अकबर कह के वो छलांग मारते हैं to try to cut her breast, and then she starts shouting. So, well, she was treated. This had been lingering on since 47. Episodic thing was all right for some time, then not again. Now the interesting thing was that some years later, the teenage daughter who had brought her had exactly the similar symptoms. The same Muslimans and Allahu Akbar and the same, threatening to cut her breasts now because she was now grown up. And then not just that, almost simultaneously the youngest brother and the youngest sister. So 4 members of the same family. Now the interesting thing actually comes some years later when I forged an association of sorts between the mental health professionals of the 2 Punjabs, Pakistani and the Indian, and we took a delegation there. There was a conference, and in the evening they took us for shopping like the gracious hosts that they are, and we had an elderly Sardarji as one of the part of our delegation from Patiala, and then out of the blue, a young girl, seemingly disturbed, highly disturbed, looks at him from a distance and comes charging at him that you have been coming into our house and threatening to rape me. You look at the mirror imaging of not just, the violence. This is 20 years, 30 years after the partition of India. So this lingers on. And then there are other stories. For example, you had this boy in Shimla. He's a teenage boy, 17 years old, school going still. And in 72, he happens to see Benazir Bhutto on Shimla Road from a distance because she was there with her father for the Shimla summit, and gets besotted by her. And not just that, starts believing that she also loves him and talks to him every day during his sleep. And the whole, delusional thing woven on, and then they talk about Pakistan problems, their relationship, and the boy becomes sympathetic to the Pakistani cause. Benazir Bhutto seemingly becomes sympathetic to the Indian cause, and the boy tells his father, why haven't we released their prisoners so far? We promised them. And that's sort of stories.
Dr. Kala, this story, I'd like you to, the other story which stays with me is, the kind of, in spite of partition, bloodshed, hatred, the kind of empathy or attraction that stayed for the other. Is the story of a man in Pakistan, an executive, who falls ill every time Amitabh Bachchan is ill.
Yeah, the story is called Mr. Haq. He comes into the psychiatric clinic for his depression every few years, and the psychiatrist, treats him for his the patient calls his blue funks. Interestingly, his blue funks coincided every time Amitabh Bachchan fell ill. Whether it was time of the shooting of the film Coolie or when he was diagnosed as myasthenia gravis. And as long as Amitabh Bachchan, and then the news wasn't really available about up-to-date health bulletins and so on, there was no internet. And so he says that I take this medicines, they sometimes help, they sometimes help partially, but actually मैं ठीक तभी होता हूँ, मैं कहाँ से ठीक हो जाऊँगा डॉक्टर साहब जब वो वहाँ पड़ा है, उसके टेस्ट हो रहे हैं, तो जब वो पिछली बार हम मक्का गए थे तो फिर वो ठीक हो गया, मैं भी ठीक हो गया, अब मेरी बीवी कह रही है फिर से मक्का चलते हैं, तो डॉक्टर पूछता है कि किसकी हेल्थ के लिए जाओ, किसके ठीक होने के लिए? नहीं, अमिताभ बच्चन के आप कोर्स में तो फिर अपने आप ठीक हो जाओगे.
In fact, I suggest that Dr. Kala's book and Reena Anand's book are available here, and you'll find fascinating narration in them. I'm told the time is very little, so Sanjoy, we move to you. And Sanjoy, of course, is an authority on Northeast. Whatever you'd like to say about migration, and maybe a little bit about the Dalit Sikhs of Shillong and Guwahati, it might interest the audience.
I'm looking at time's up, and press DEL to reset, escape to exit. So we press escape to exit. There were three things I wanted to share. I'll just take literally 3 minutes. One is that many of us, you've talked of refugees, you're talking of migrants, you're talking also partly of migrants, refugees, and I think there are two categories which one referred to earlier. One is the legal migrants, the other is the internal displacees. And in our narrative in this country, when people talk about immigrants or illegal immigrants, they mix everybody up. People who suffered from flood bank erosion or lost their homes and are migrants, suddenly they become them and us. They become the other. And we understand a place like what many people call the Northeast, a state like Assam or even Manipur better, when we see through the prism of insiders and outsiders. There are some who say we are local, we are the indigenous, we are the insiders. Everybody else is the other, the outsider. And I think if we see it in that prism, it begins to start making a lot of sense. And every community sees the other as an intruder or a potential intruder, because the battle is not just of minds, but it's also physically for resources and land. The Dalit Sikhs of Shillong are a classic example of this. They were brought to work as sanitation workers by the British at the time, 150 years ago. They had the sanction of the local king, the Siam. 150 years later, this has erupted as a major issue because they are seen as the outsider. You don't belong here. But they came from Gurdaspur. They're all from Gurdaspur. Sometimes they marry their children into Gurdaspur, or they marry into Gurdaspur. But everybody comes there. It's a small colony where several hundred people live. There are 4 gurdwaras and 3 churches in that little pocket of land. And what has happened is that because they are seen as these outsiders who are not going away, they became the targets of a very strong attack by mobs, which was, I think again triggered by political intrusion. Now their point is very simple. We have nowhere else to go. So if we have nowhere else to go, why would you want to throw us out, but give us an alternative space? And even that is not coming forward. So, there are situations like that which have virtually, which call for accommodation, political and social. And that comes only when people are prepared to respect each other and learn from each other. The one thing I'll close with as far as the Dalit Sikhs are concerned, 2 things. The riots went on, attacks went on for something like a week. I was in Shillong when they started, and when it was going on, we could hear the burst of tear gas. Not a single shot was fired by the police. More police got injured than either the Sikhs or the rioters. And ultimately, the thing calmed down. So there was, a modicum, shall we say, of, if not, there was lesser violence than there could have been. The second thing I want to say is that many of these people, they have gone into other professions. They're no longer doing what they came for, what they were brought for by the British. The children are in banks, they're teaching, they're doing other things. So I think this is really part of the problem, that we do not accept that people are moving on, that they're changing, and there is, that bell is really irritating. And I think the others who've heard it will say so. We heard you. I can close here, but I'll just say that, without respect for each other, incidents like that will continue to happen because it's a question of who's the outsider and who's the insider. Ultimately, we're still defining that in the Northeast. And that's why the book Strangers No More is, we're still strangers to each other, we're still discovering each other.
Thank you. Enjoy and thank you, all of you. Is there any
Take them down below.
The questions over drinks.
It's actually just announced.